You know what's hilarious? We talk about boomers. We obsess over millennials. We can't stop analyzing Gen Z. But there's this entire generation sitting in the corner, arms crossed, wearing flannel, just watching the chaos unfold with a smirk. That's Gen X, and honestly, they might be the most psychologically fascinating generation we've completely ignored. See, Gen X doesn't demand attention. They don't need participation trophies or viral TikToks. They're the ones who learned to be invisible, and somehow that made them powerful. Today, we're diving deep into the minds of the generation that raised themselves, survived the weirdest cultural shift in American history, and somehow became the most self-sufficient humans on the planet. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why Gen X might just be laughing at all of us. Let's start with something wild. Gen X is roughly 65 million people born between 1965 and 1980. They're currently between 44 and 59 years old. And here's the kicker. They're the smallest generation in American history, sandwiched between two of the largest. Boomers, 76 million. Millennials, 72 million. Gen X, they're literally the forgotten middle child of American generations, and psychologically, that shaped everything about them. Now, imagine growing up and nobody's really paying attention to you. Your parents are boomers who are busy figuring out their own identity crisis, divorcing at record rates, and basically inventing the concept of finding yourself. Meanwhile, you're 8 years old with a house key around your neck, letting yourself in after school, making your own snacks and figuring out life solo. This wasn't occasional. This was the norm. They literally called them latchkey kids. Here's where it gets interesting from a psychological standpoint. When children are forced into independence early, their brains develop different coping mechanisms. Gen X didn't have helicopter parents. They had parents who were barely in the helicopter. So, what happened? They became incredibly self-reliant. They learned that if something needed to get done, they had to do it themselves. No one was coming to save them. No one was going to solve their problems. And this created a generation with an almost superhuman ability to handle adversity without complaining. But wait, there's more to this story. Let's talk about what they were watching on TV as kids. Sesame Street told them that everyone was special and unique. Mr. Rogers told them they were loved just the way they were. Sounds nice, right? Except their actual lived experience was completely different. Their parents were getting divorced at rates America had never seen before. Between 1970 and 1980, the divorce rate in the United States doubled. So Gen X kids were getting mixed messages. TV said you're special, but real life said you're kind of on your own, kiddo. This created what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, and Gen X dealt with it in the most Gen X way possible. They stopped believing the hype. They became skeptical, cynical even. They looked at institutions, authority figures, and grand promises with one eyebrow raised. Show them, don't tell them. Prove it. This wasn't being negative. This was survival. They'd been lied to enough times to know that words were cheap. And here's something absolutely fascinating. Because Gen X grew up without constant supervision, they developed an internal locus of control. That's psychology speak for believing that you control your own destiny, not external forces. Compare that to generations before and after. Boomers often had an external locus tied to institutions and social movements. Millennials and Gen Z often feel controlled by systems they can't change, leading to anxiety and depression. But Gen X? They just figured, okay, the world's messed up, but I can handle my corner of it. That's power. Let's talk about entertainment for a second because this reveals so much about their psychology. Gen X grew up with MTV, when MTV actually played music videos. They watched the birth of grunge, alternative rock, and hip-hop going mainstream. Their icons weren't polished pop stars. They were Kurt Cobain in a ratty sweater, Tupac speaking truth, and bands that looked like they just rolled out of someone's garage. Why? Because authenticity mattered more than perfection. Gen X could smell fake from a mile away, and they rejected it hard. Think about the movies they loved. The Breakfast Club, Reality Bites, Clerks, Pulp Fiction, Fight Club. What do all these have in common? They questioned everything. Authority, society, the American dream, corporate culture, consumerism. Gen X was psychologically wired to ask, but why though? And Hollywood gave them stories that reflected that question in nature. Now, here's where Gen X's psychology gets really interesting in the workplace. They entered the job market in the late 80s and 90s, right when corporations were starting to break the social contract. Their parents had been promised that if you worked hard and stayed loyal to a company, you'd get a pension and retire comfortably. Gen X watched those promises get shattered. They saw their parents get laid off after decades of service. They saw pensions disappear. They saw the rug pulled out from under the very people who played by the rules. So, what did Gen X do? They adapted. They became entrepreneurial. They stopped expecting loyalty from employers and instead focused on building skills and value. They invented the side hustle before we even called it that. They were the first generation to really embrace the idea that you might have 5 or 6 different careers in your lifetime, not because you wanted to, but because you had to. And psychologically, this made them incredibly resilient and flexible. But let's get real about the challenges this created. All that independence and self-reliance came with a cost. Gen X has some of the highest rates of what psychologists call emotional guardedness. They don't open up easily. They don't ask for help naturally. They've been conditioned to handle things on their own, which is great for survival, but not always great for mental health and relationships. They're the generation most likely to say, "I'm fine," when they're absolutely not fine, and actually mean it because they've convinced themselves they can handle it. Here's a perfect example. Gen X lived through the AIDS crisis as teenagers and young adults. They watched friends die. They watched the government ignore it. They watched an entire community get decimated. And what did mainstream culture do? Not nearly enough. So Gen X learned another harsh lesson. Sometimes the cavalry isn't coming, and sometimes the people in charge don't care. You have to take care of your own people. This created tight-knit communities and fierce loyalty among friends, but also a deep distrust of institutions. Let's talk about technology for a minute because Gen X's relationship with it is psychologically unique. They're the bridge generation. They grew up analog but adapted to digital. They remember life before the internet, before cell phones, before social media. They made plans by calling landlines and actually showing up. They passed notes in class instead of texting. They had to actually go to Blockbuster to rent a movie. But then they adapted. They learned computers, embraced email, figured out smartphones, and now they're on social media too. But here's the thing. Because they remember before, they have perspective that digital natives don't have. A Gen Xer can have a smartphone in their pocket and still be perfectly comfortable unplugging for a weekend. They don't have FOMO the way younger generations do because they remember when missing out was just normal life. You didn't know what your friends were doing every second of every day, and that was fine. This gives them a psychological flexibility with technology that's pretty rare. And can we talk about how Gen X handles stress? Because this is wild. Research shows that Gen X uses humor and irony as primary coping mechanisms more than any other generation. They make jokes about disaster. They're sarcastic about serious things. Why? Because when you grew up watching the world tell you it might end in nuclear war at any moment, you either laugh or you break. Gen X chose laughter. Dark humor, sure, but humor nonetheless. Think about it. They grew up during the Cold War doing duck and cover drills as if hiding under a desk would save you from a nuclear bomb. They lived through the Challenger explosion, watched it happen live in classrooms across America. They saw the Oklahoma City bombing, Columbine, 9/11. They watched the economy crash multiple times. And through it all, their response has been essentially, well, that's on brand for the timeline. It's not that they don't care. It's that they've developed psychological armor made of gallows humor and realistic expectations. Here's something most people don't realize about Gen X. They're incredibly loyal in relationships, but they take forever to commit. Why? Trust issues rooted in childhood. Remember those divorce rates? Gen X watched the fairy tale of marriage crumble in real time. They saw their parents split up, watched blended families struggle, witnessed the messiness of adult relationships up close. So, when they approach their own relationships, they're cautious. They want to be sure. They're not jumping in with both feet until they've tested the water, checked the temperature, and maybe built a backup plan. But once they commit, they're ride or die, because Gen X values authenticity and loyalty above almost everything else. They've been burned enough to know what real connection looks like, and when they find it, they protect it fiercely. They're the friend who shows up at 3 a.m. when you need help moving a body, metaphorically speaking, mostly metaphorically. Let's talk about Gen X as parents, because this is where their psychology really shows up in fascinating ways. They're often called helicopter parent light. They're not hovering constantly like some millennials, but they're also not absent like their own parents were. They found a middle ground. They want to be present and involved, but they also believe kids need independence and the ability to fail. They're the parents who let their kids walk to school alone, but also show up to every soccer game. They're trying to give their kids what they didn't have, while also teaching them the self-reliance they learned. And here's something interesting. Gen X parents are often more open with their kids about difficult topics. They talk about money struggles. They're honest about mistakes. They don't try to present a perfect facade. Why? Because they grew up with facades and saw right through them. They value realness over perfection, and they're passing that on. It's a psychological gift, even if their kids don't realize it yet. Now, let's address the elephant in the room: Gen X and mental health. This generation came of age when therapy was still pretty stigmatized. Just deal with it was the advice. Suck it up was the mantra. Mental health wasn't part of the conversation the way it is now. So Gen X developed their own coping mechanisms, not all of them healthy. Some self-medicated, some threw themselves into work, some just internalized everything and built walls. The strong, silent type wasn't just a stereotype, it was survival. But here's what's changing. As Gen X hits middle age, many are finally starting to address their mental health. They're going to therapy. They're talking about anxiety and depression. They're recognizing that maybe handling everything alone all the time isn't actually healthy. It's a slow shift, and it's harder for them than for younger generations who grew up with mental health awareness, but it's happening. And that takes real courage when you've spent 40-plus years being the strong one. Something else that's psychologically unique about Gen X: they're the first generation to really embrace the idea that you can reinvent yourself multiple times. They've had to. The economy kept changing, technology kept evolving, and they kept adapting. They went from typewriters to computers to smartphones. They pivoted careers when industries collapsed. They learned new skills in their 30s, 40s, 50s. This created a growth mindset out of necessity, and it's made them incredibly adaptable. But there's a darker side to all this adaptability. Gen X has high rates of burnout because they've been adapting and hustling for decades without much recognition or support. They're the generation stuck financially supporting both their aging boomer parents and their struggling millennial kids while trying to save for their own retirement. They're the sandwich generation, and the pressure is real. Psychologically, this creates stress that many of them just absorb and keep moving because that's what they've always done. Here's a fun fact that reveals a lot about Gen X psychology. They're the least likely generation to post on social media regularly, but when they do, it's usually something substantive or sarcastic. They're not posting their lunch. They're not doing duck-face selfies. They're sharing a news article with a snarky comment or posting a throwback to some obscure band from the 90s. Why? Because they value substance and they're allergic to anything that feels like performance or fakeness. Social media often feels performative to them, so they engage selectively. Let's talk about Gen X and authority one more time, because this is crucial to understanding their psychology. They don't automatically respect authority just because someone has a title. They respect competence, authenticity, and results. You have to earn their respect. This makes them amazing employees when they believe in what they're doing and terrible employees when they think management is incompetent. They'll absolutely question a stupid policy to your face. They're not trying to be difficult. They just have a highly developed BS detector and low tolerance for inefficiency. This also makes them great leaders when they get the chance. Gen X leaders tend to be practical, straightforward, and focused on results rather than politics. They value work-life balance because they remember the cost of not having it. They're more likely to tell you to go home and spend time with your family than to praise you for working 80-hour weeks. They lead with authenticity rather than authority, and people respond to that. Now, here's something beautiful about Gen X psychology. They have a deeply ingrained sense of fairness and social justice, but they're skeptical of performative activism. They came of age during the birth of hip-hop culture, grunge, and alternative movements that questioned everything. They were part of the generation that pushed for LGBTQ rights, environmental awareness, and racial justice before it was mainstream. But they did it by actually doing the work, not just posting about it. They show up, they vote, they volunteer, they just don't necessarily announce it on social media. Let's talk about nostalgia for a second because Gen X has an interesting relationship with it. They're nostalgic for certain things from their youth, the music, the freedom, the simplicity, but they're also realistic about what wasn't great. They don't romanticize the past the way some boomers do. They remember the good stuff, like Saturday morning cartoons and mixtapes, but they also remember the bad stuff, like rampant bullying with no intervention and how smoking was allowed basically everywhere. They take the lessons and move forward. That's psychological maturity. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Gen X has an incredibly high tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty. They grew up in a world that was rapidly changing and often confusing. The rules kept shifting. What worked yesterday didn't work today. So they learned to be comfortable with "I don't know" and "let's figure it out as we go." This is a psychological skill that's incredibly valuable, especially in today's world where change is the only constant. While other generations sometimes struggle with uncertainty and need clear answers, Gen X can operate in the gray areas. Let's discuss Gen X and consumerism, because their psychology around this is fascinating. They grew up during the rise of brand culture and advertising targeted at youth. They were the first kids marketed to directly and aggressively. And you know what happened? They became incredibly brand loyal in some ways and completely anti-establishment in others. They'll buy the same brand of jeans for 20 years if they work, but they'll also reject entire industries they see as corrupt or fake. They value quality and longevity over trends. They still have and use things from the 90s. They repair instead of replace. This is partly economic necessity, but also psychological preference. Another aspect of Gen X psychology that's important. They have a strong DIY ethic. They learn to fix things, build things, and figure things out themselves. YouTube tutorials. Gen X was doing that before YouTube existed. They were reading manuals, calling their one friend who knew about cars or plumbing or computers, and trial and error learning. This created a sense of capability and confidence that's deeply psychological. They believe they can learn to do almost anything if they have to, and usually they're right. Now, let's talk about something vulnerable: Gen X and aging. They're watching their parents get older and dealing with their own aging process, and psychologically, this is hitting them hard. They're the generation that grew up on MTV and youth culture. They're not ready to be the old generation yet, but they're also practical enough to deal with it. They're getting older with the same dark humor they've applied to everything else. They make jokes about needing reading glasses and groaning when they stand up, but underneath, they're processing the reality of mortality and legacy. And speaking of legacy, Gen X is starting to wonder about theirs. They've spent so much time being ignored and overlooked that they're questioning what mark they'll leave on the world. And here's the truth: their legacy is huge. They built the internet economy. They created the startup culture. They pioneered remote work. They're the bridge that made it possible for younger generations to have the technology and freedoms they have now. They just did it quietly, without demanding credit, because that's the most Gen X thing possible. Here's something else. Gen X has an amazing ability to accept people as they are without judgment. Growing up in diverse environments, being exposed to different cultures and ideas, and learning to question societal norms made them remarkably open-minded. They're the generation that's most likely to say, "You do you," and actually mean it. They don't care if you're weird. They're weird too. They don't care about fitting in because they never really fit in themselves. This psychological acceptance creates spaces where people can be authentic, and that's a gift. Let's talk money psychology for a minute. Gen X is financially conservative out of necessity. They lived through multiple recessions. They saw retirement accounts disappear overnight. They learned not to count on anything being stable. So they save when they can. They're skeptical of get-rich-quick schemes. They value financial independence above almost everything because they know how quickly security can vanish. This sometimes makes them seem pessimistic, but it's really just protective realism born from experience. You know what's interesting? Gen X is the generation that's most comfortable being uncomfortable. They don't need constant validation. They don't need to be comfortable all the time. They can sit with difficult emotions, complex problems, and uncertain futures without falling apart. This isn't because they're tougher than other generations. It's because they've had decades of practice. Every time the world threw something at them, they adapted. It became their baseline. Here's a psychological pattern that's uniquely Gen X. They plan for the worst, but hope for the best. It's pragmatic optimism. They're not doom and gloom, but they're also not naive. They'll have a backup plan and a backup to the backup plan, but they'll still shoot their shot on the dream. They'll invest in the risky startup while also keeping their day job. They'll pursue passion projects while maintaining practical income. It's a psychological balance that serves them well. And let's talk about Gen X friendships because these are special. Gen X friends are the ones who cannot talk to you for 6 months and then pick up exactly where you left off. There's no guilt, no drama, just acceptance that life gets busy. They value quality over quantity in relationships. They'd rather have 3 real friends than 300 Facebook friends. And those real friends? They're family. Gen X understands chosen family better than almost any generation because many of them had to create it when biological family was absent or dysfunctional. Something beautiful happens when you talk to Gen Xers about their psychology. They're incredibly self-aware, but not self-obsessed. They've done the work of understanding themselves, often through hard experience rather than therapy or self-help books. They know their triggers, their patterns, their strengths and weaknesses. But they don't make it everyone else's problem. They handle their stuff and keep moving. There's a quiet dignity in that. As we wrap this up, here's what strikes me most about Gen X psychology. They're survivors who became more than just survivors. They could have become bitter and cynical and stayed there. Instead, they became adaptable, resourceful, authentic, and surprisingly hopeful despite everything. They raised themselves and then raised their kids better. They built careers in impossible economic conditions. They adapted to massive technological changes. They questioned everything and built new things. Gen X doesn't need you to notice them. They're fine being the forgotten generation. In fact, they kind of prefer it. Less attention means more freedom to do things their way. And that's exactly what they've always done. Their way. Not the popular way, not the easy way. Their way. And psychologically, that independence, that self-reliance, that authenticity, that's their superpower. So the next time you're ignoring Gen X, remember this. They're watching, they're learning, they're adapting, and they're probably 3 steps ahead of everyone else because they've been playing this game longer. They survived being ignored as kids and turned it into an advantage. They're the generation that doesn't need the spotlight because they learned to generate their own light. And maybe, just maybe, there's something we can all learn from the psychology of Gen X. Maybe we could all benefit from a little more self-reliance, a little more skepticism of BS, a little more dark humor, and a lot more authenticity. Maybe we could worry less about being noticed and more about being real. Maybe we could build our own lives instead of waiting for permission. Gen X figured that out decades ago. The rest of us are just catching up. If you made it this far, you're probably either Gen X nodding along and thinking, yep, nailed it, or you're from another generation realizing you've been sleeping on the most interesting people in the room. Either way, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started diving into the psychology of generations, culture, and what makes us tick. Drop a comment and let me know what generation you are and whether I got this right. And hey, if you're Gen X, let us know. What did we miss? What's the psychology thing nobody talks about? Let's keep this conversation going. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, whatever.